Hey everyone, thanks for coming. I hope everyone's having a good conference so far. I've definitely been enjoying it. It's my first Druid Summit, so it's been great so far. Yeah, so thanks for coming. I'm going to start sharing my screen then. So let's do window. Perfect. All right. Hope everyone can see this, and we will go into presenter mode. So today I'm going to talk about speed. So I think everyone here who's using Druid on a regular basis, this is obviously a very common theme. I think that's what kind of draws people to Apache Druid is just kind of the focus on real time analytics, the focus on speed and availability of data quickly. And I come from the Superset community, so my natural counterpart is how do we turn that kind of data and the real-time nature of Druid and pair that with a end user dashboarding BI tool that actually can end up being a great match made in heaven, basically. So this is kind of I'll start with just talking a little bit about myself. So my background's in data science and developer advocacy. So I'm a committer to the Apache Superset project, which has been around for about 4 years now. And I joined Preset about a year and a half ago. Preset was founded by Max Büchemann, who is the original creator of Apache Airflow and Apache Superset. He created both of those around the same time when he was at Airbnb. And before joining Preset, I spent over 7 years in data science and data science education broadly. I came from a company called DataQuest that I helped scale from 1 to 35 people and led product and content education there. And so we were basically building a platform for data skills. So I was really passionate about moving from teaching, helping people learn data skills and actually work on making the tools themselves better, right? I think one of the motivating factors for Superset is to basically enable every team. So that was really exciting vision, and I decided to join on working on making the tools better. And before DataQuest, I spent a few years at a few different places. Briefly at a startup called Radius Intelligence, which is no longer around. And I was also at the IBM Watson team, and I was in college, which was an interesting experience as well. So I've kind of been in data for a while, and I'm kind of broadly really passionate about how we make data access much more easy and just much more available. So I'll start my talk by talking a little bit about Superset for people who maybe not familiar. So Superset's a modern open source BI platform. We're based kind of on Python and React, TypeScript, so kind of a very modern web stack, basically. And Superset works with nearly any SQL speaking data engine. So through an abstraction layer, which I'll talk a little bit about later, called SQL Alchemy, Superset's able to basically speak to any SQL database engine, or can be extended to work with any SQL speaking data engine, which is great because a lot of organizations, their data lives in a lot of different places. And Superset ships with about 60 or 65 charts, visualization types right out of the box. And if you include the kind of tweaks and customizations you can do with that, you're kind of getting into the hundreds. And because Superset is open source, every part of it can be completely customized. So if you have a specific use case that isn't well supported by the core community, you're welcome to push for that, change in the community, or kind of go and fork it and use it on your own, which a number of people have done. And you can also support new types of databases, like if you're some company that maintains its own database, like some high frequency trading firm or something, right? They might use their own proprietary database. It's not that much more work to extend Superset to work with that database, which is great. Same with chart types. There's only so many. While there are a lot of charts, sometimes you need a specific type of chart, and being able to customize that is really important. And that's kind of our philosophy in the Superset community. So Superset really has its roots when Max was kind of frustrated working in data engineering at Airbnb. So at the time, they were using Druid. They were early adopters of Druid at Airbnb, and even to this day, Airbnb plus Superset is Apache Druid plus Superset is a very popular solution, and they've kind of built a big part of the data platform at Airbnb around that combination. So at the time, Tableau was the tool of choice for BI. It was just kind of a no-brainer. It's what you used, but it didn't support Druid. At the time, Tableau really preferred, databases have a SQL interface, and at that time, Druid did not. So there was some kind of waiting period until a native integration was built. And eventually, that was added, but at the time that was a blocker, right? So after open sourcing Airflow, I think Max just saw the potential of, well, why can't we just build it ourselves, right? I think Max just can't stop seeming to start open source data tooling projects when he's kind of blocked by what the industry standard is. So so the core of the roots of Superset are very much tied to the rise of Druid, which is why a lot of people use them together, and they couple super well together. In addition, Tableau has a Windows-centric approach. You have these Windows servers that you deploy and manage, and that's just kind of a world that we're moving away from, right, in the web. And if you kind of want to learn more about his story here and his kind of promise and vision for open source BI, we have this great blog post he wrote called "The Future of BI is Open Source," and he kind of lays out his reasoning there. So people who are interested. But since it's a Druid conference, I'm sure most people are generally sold on the idea of open source data tooling. So there's kind of two main workflows in Superset, and both of these kind of enable speed at a different level, right? So the theme of this talk really is speed and how both of these tools together enable a really quick and tight iteration loop. So on the left, you have Explore, which is the no-code chart builder interface in Superset. So here, Superset's backend basically generates SQL queries on the user's behalf. They kind of they pick from a drop-down menu, and through SQL Alchemy, which is a kind of pretty interesting platform hack, I would say, by the early contributors, we were able to basically get just, SQL Alchemy originally existed because they wanted, Python developers wanted to be able to interface with a large number of databases using kind of this OOP type of syntax. It's limited in some ways, if you want to do crazy joins and that are, or you want a lot of control over how data is joined, it's not going to be as good. But, for most cases, if you have fact and dimension tables, like it's just kind of works super well. So for that same reason why I think that the community behind SQL Alchemy doesn't want to write raw SQL queries, it's the same design goals of SQL Alchemy that allows Superset to have a no-code interface where the queries are generated for end users. And because of no code, it improves speed of iteration. So if you want to tweak your query or tweak the data that's being queried, you just kind of click a button and it's modified and updated, which is great. So obviously the main target here, persona, is data professionals. So you might be a marketing data analyst or even a data scientist, full on. You might be a financial analyst, someone who is kind of has access to the underlying data, but they don't want to spend 4 hours in SQL editor just to get one chart. They kind of work in an organization where they have relatively clean data, and they just want to look at a chart and make a dashboard, right? So you can get to kind of question to dashboard in under 10 minutes, which is great. And on the right side, you have SQL Lab. So this is the browser-based SQL IDE. So Superset, this is where there's not much interception. If you write a query in the SQL Lab, it's going to go straight to your database, for better or for worse. So if you don't know what you're doing, then you can definitely take down your database, I suppose. But for the most part, this is used by some data professionals who need to do some super custom join, maybe, or obviously by data engineers who want to create virtual data sets, publish them in the semantic layer. So if you're kind of marketing analyst or financial analyst wants to be able to create a chart that requires joining three tables, a data engineer might be or an analytics engineer may be tasked with creating that query, publishing in the semantic layer for everyone to use, and then people can go off to the races. So this kind of offers much more control for people who want that. And this is just a kind of an image for people, a visual. So on the left, you have kind of the Explore window. So here's a chart where we're visualizing. This is actually real data from our Superset Slack community. This shows the top 10 channels. So in Slack, we have over 30 channels. This shows the top 10 ones, and it shows the number of messages per channel as an area chart. So on the left, we just kind of went in, we specified a time column, which was TS for timestamp. You have time grain. This is done on a daily basis. Interestingly enough, it just makes the chart kind of look better. Like if you do weekly or monthly, it's kind of too large of a scale for this type of chart sometimes, and it just makes it look prettier, which is kind of cool. And then you'll see on the query, you'll see metrics. It's just counting, and then we filtered out the GitHub notifications channel because that's a bot channel. So we're not interested in looking at the messages sent there. We specified the group by, and voila. So you can kind of imagine how this turns into SQL. It's not magical, but for people who want to move quickly, this is super empowering. And so, as I mentioned earlier, SQL Alchemy, right? This is a big reason for Superset's rise, I would say, and what also enables that no-code interface. So this is kind of a diagrammatic explanation of what happens. So on the top, if you are writing your SQL query in SQL Lab, it mostly kind of just hits through the Python DB API, which kind of exposes this Python connection object cursor, the connection objects, that type of interface that you'll see for people who are Python notebook geeks like myself. You'll see that type of syntax. So that when you write a query in SQL Lab, it's just going to use that interface, but it's mostly not being touched by Superset at all. On the bottom, you see what actually happens when you give a set of parameters in the no-code Explore interface. You'll see q equals SQL Alchemy dot select, et cetera, et cetera. You see this kind of query formation happening in SQL Alchemy through this object-oriented interface, and then that query is then sent. The final query is generated below and sent to your database. So this kind of just shows some of the stuff underneath that's powering the whole solution. So Druid plus Superset equals speed. So what do I mean by that, right? What I really mean by that, and really the kind of general thesis of this talk is just Druid and Superset together, just out of the box, without much more complexity or stuff in the middle, gives you really fast turnaround times. And what I mean by fast is if you're building a dashboard or a chart, you can get less than 1 second round trip. I will fairly say this is mostly because of Druid. Druid is incredible here. And here on the left, I have just some COVID kind of data set that I loaded in. Now you can imagine a Kafka stream instead being fed in, or something else entirely, a data set from S3, et cetera. And right out of the box, as long as you've set up Druid correctly and you've set up the segmenting the way you need to, and it's you're kind of doing the usual Druid stuff that you would be doing for any other tool, then Superset will query it really quickly, just usually in a few hundred milliseconds, and then you have the chart. And because the aggregation is happening at the Druid level, it's highly configurable, just like you would with anything else. So I think this is kind of the general theme: is the Superset community wants speed, but it doesn't want to have a strong opinion and have a thick kind of ingestion layer or a lot of kind of compute happening in the BI layer. We're kind of very much against the model that some, I would say, legacy BI vendors have, which is, well, the only way to kind of guarantee that charts and dashboards can be fast is we obviously cannot trust the underlying database. We don't know what they're doing. So instead, we need to force ingestion into our own proprietary data layer, which is really challenging, right? That means the BI company also ends up having to be a database vendor, which is a slightly different problem. And it also creates lock-in. That's something we've seen a lot on the preset side as well, is there's definitely some people who wish that they could just load all their data into Superset and it just kind of work. But 90% of the organizations we speak with, they've already made heavy investments in their data stack, and they want to see the return on those investments. They're not interested in having yet another database or yet another index at the BI layer just to power charts and dashboards. And so it's kind of a cheeky talk title. I would say most of the heavy lifting is actually done by Druid, thankfully. And I'll talk a little bit about when that's not enough, what you actually do. The other thing is that Superset and Druid are both heavily focused on time series data, right? So if you want to do if you want to do certain types of discrete visualizations, you want to do chord diagrams or complicated just kind of pairwise heat maps, you can do that in Druid and Superset. It's just really not optimized for it, right? So doing doing binning and group by on time is what both tools are really good at, and this is why we consistently see product teams and analytics teams and anyone where, or even marketing teams, anywhere where time and looking at daily and weekly, monthly user activity or revenue activity, that type of thing is really important, which is quite a kind of lot of use cases in many organizations. That's really where Druid and Superset shine well together. So on the top left corner, you'll see time grains. So Superset supports basically all the time grains that you'd be interested in. And if you want to extend it and add more, or if Druid kind of down the road adds even more specific time grains, you basically just add 2 lines of code in the Druid database engine spec in the Superset project, and it pretty much all the features around that time grain just kind of work out of the box, which is great. So if you're using dashboard filters with super fine grained millisecond level granularity, it'll all just work, which is awesome. On top right corner, this is kind of a cool prototype that's done. It is in the core Superset. I don't know if that's really where the project is going to move, but because of the Facebook Profit library, and which is written in Python and integrates well with the Pandas ecosystem. Superset is also written in Python, integrates with the Pandas and Arrow ecosystem as well. Because of that, after an aggregation is done in Superset for this time series Echarts type in Superset, you can actually do predictive modeling. So in the top right corner, that we have a blog post about this actually, where we do time series forecasting using Druid and Superset, which is super cool. And then you automatically get this visualization with uncertainty built in. So as I mentioned, I don't necessarily see forecasting being a big part of Superset's future. It's kind of a cool thing that just shows off, what the tooling can do. But it is kind of cool and just showcases just the real focus on time series in general. And lastly, in the bottom, we have a bunch of different time series charts. And so there used to be, so the Superset community is moving all of its charts over to Echarts. And so for the longest time, there was just a single Echarts time series chart. And now the community's broken that into 6 different chart types. And I would expect to see many more coming. So time series visualizations, big part of both of these projects. So what happens when the default configuration is not enough? You have a few different options. So I will say I'm not a Druid expert. I'm relatively new to Druid. I've only been using it for a few months now, but I do know that segmenting by timescale, that the timescale that your end users care about the most in their dashboards is a super win for speed here. As I mentioned earlier, because Superset is supporting very rich time grains, you can kind of audit the dashboards in your organization, the types of data assets that are actually being created internally, and try to understand the most common behavior. So if people are doing daily and weekly the most, you don't really need that millisecond stock market type of data slicing, then that's where I would recommend kind of focusing and investing on your Druid segmentation strategy, basically, because ultimately that strategy is going to kind of trickle nicely into Superset. On the Superset side, there's more you can do. So Superset, despite all my spiel about the community not wanting to have a super thick ingestion and compute layer, there is a very thin caching layer that you can use. This is important because if you're looking at a dashboard, if a million people are looking at the same exact dashboard and the data has not changed in the last hour or whatever kind of interval you specify, there's really no point in querying Druid again for that exact same information. So Superset has a cache that is highly configurable. So you can basically, the way it works is the cache actually exists at every level in Superset. So you can have dataset level caching. So you may just want globally anyone who's connecting to Druid in Superset, you may want the timeout to be like 1 minute or 50 minutes or 60 minutes or even kind of 24 hours. If let's say you're loading a bunch of data, you don't want people going crazy with it, you're okay showing slightly older data because you would prefer that the dashboards load immediately. You can kind of design that in your Superset installation, which is great. And you can also specify it for charts and dashboards. So as you kind of get more sophisticated about your segmenting, you can actually say that certain types of dashboards, if you're launching a new product, you want these 4 or 5 dashboards and the charts within those dashboards to have a very low refresh interval. So you want those to be refreshing every 5 seconds or 2 seconds, and you can do that. And then the cache will be ignored. You'll get raw Druid data going into Superset. That data will be cached again, but if you have a very low and aggressive interval, then you'll kind of pretty much be seeing as close to live data as you probably want to see. The other great thing is because of the API in Superset, you can actually time this in a very strategic way. So you can, for example, I've spoken to many teams that have done Airflow jobs that kind of segment data and warm the data in Druid. The second that's ready at the time grain that they're interested in, you can make a call to the Superset API and actually manually invalidate the cache. So this is one way as well to make sure that the data that you've prepared, the freshness is kind of linked in Druid to the freshness that you want in the charts and dashboards in Superset. So super powerful way to kind of synchronize the freshness that you care about, essentially. So next, I kind of want to talk about some of the recent Superset additions that kind of hopefully are just interesting to people who don't kind of live and breathe Superset like I do every day. And then I'll talk a little bit about the future of the project and what we're excited about in the community. So dashboard native filters, this is a big one. So for the longest time, basically since the project was created, I believe, creating dashboard filters meant adding a new chart type to your dashboard, which is kind of a pretty wacky idea if you kind of think about it. But it was a hack to reuse some of the NVD3 components that were already in the project towards servicing dashboard filtering functionality, which is pretty standard. You kind of expect your BI tool to be able to do filtering on arbitrary columns and time levels and stuff like that. And so the community has now migrated over to dashboard native filters. It is kind of still behind a feature flag, but it is very, very close to just being completely turned on and the feature flag basically being deprecated for anyone who's using it new, basically. So that's super exciting. What this really does is it's mostly kind of a huge UX boost, but also a major technical refactor, because this allows the community to work on things like cross-filtering. So we have behind the feature flag, we have cross-filtering kind of working, which is awesome. So this is Tableau and Power BI. A lot of tools have this. This is not specific to Superset, but this is essentially what lets you have charts emit events that impact other charts. So if you click on a bar in a bar chart and you want to see all the COVID vaccinations for India, for example, and you can click on one chart that has that bar, and then that'll kind of emit a filter event that the other charts can consume. So again, very common in BI tools, but has not been in Superset historically. So this type of technical refactoring was kind of a prereq for enabling things like cross-filtering, because when filters were a chart type, they were very much isolated containers. If you have 9 charts in a dashboard and one of them is a filter chart, it just couldn't impact in the same way that kind of a native filter component could. This also enables things like drill down. So if you see a segment in a chart that you want to drill down deeper into or kind of pull out the data, this native filter was kind of a prereq to actually making that happen. So now that the native filters are out, there's kind of a nice bright future here. And in fact, just last week's the code is also much more easier to maintain and approachable. So people are adding new types of filters as well, which is super cool. As a BI tool, you always want more charts. You can never have too many. So as I mentioned earlier, the community is slowly migrating all of the chart types over to Echarts. Currently, there's a mix of NVD3 charts, which are built on top of D3. It's basically a library that is not, that's kind of on the downswing. It's not seeing contributions anymore in that community. So it added a layer on top of D3. It added things like callbacks and other features that BI tools kind of want and care about. Versus D3 is kind of a very low level layer to your data modeling in the front end. So Echarts is kind of where we're moving. Echarts is super popular. I think it has actually more stars than even the Superset project. So it's really popular, and it's spun out of either Tencent or Baidu. Maybe it was Alibaba. I forgot, one of these kind of big Chinese tech companies. So super popular, and it is a joy to use. Just in a few months, once this was kind of announced, these 9 types of charts were added into Superset. So you have this classic final chart. You have mixed time series charts. So you can take 2 types of charts, mix them together. Tree charts, super useful for visualizing hierarchies. We have kind of a revamped pivot table chart. We have this nested tree map and so on. And also, as I showed earlier, these 6 time series types chart types are all Apache Echarts. So we're kind of slowly deprecating, the community is slowly deprecating all these older NVD3 charts, which struggle with performance. And just that community and that project is just not really growing anymore, versus Apache Echarts still really strong. It's kind of a fellow Apache project, just like Druid. So there's a little bit more longevity guarantees built in, which is great. In the last year, the Superset community has focused a lot on UX improvements. So in the past, if anyone has tried to connect Druid to Superset before, the experience, it's still not perfect. It's still not where I would like it to be personally, but it's much better than just pasting in a long URL and kind of hoping for the best. Here, we now have kind of a wizard where you can actually choose the database that you're trying to connect to. And this is completely customizable. So for Preset Cloud, we're able to show a different set of logos. If we wanted to, if you're deploying Superset in your own environment, you can just show the logos that maybe you're the most interested in, right? So this whole kind of experience has been completely redesigned. So it's much more humane to actually add a new database. And we've split up, instead of just having a long CRUD form, basically, which is how it used to be for the longest time, we've added this test connection button. We've added this advanced tab. So if you wanted to add if your instance needs a specific certificate, for example, or an IAM credential or something like that, you can specify that in the advanced tab. You can also enable things like DML, for example, for certain databases where you may want to do that in the SQL editor. The second big change is the viz picker. So we used to have just a pretty ugly, just kind of form that you filled out. It's a common theme here, right? It's a lot of UI components in Superset were very much forms and CRUD fields, and now they're being redesigned for actually kind of a more pleasant visual experience. And so here you have this viz picker where there's a lot more information about the type of chart. You have an example here as well, which is great, and you can search. So all this was kind of missing in the past. So just imagine kind of being able to pick from 60 charts with just not much help. It was painful, and it no longer is, which is great. The future of Superset project. So the most relevant thing for the folks here that are using Druid with Superset is that the native Druid connector is slowly on the deprecation path. And the context here is that when Superset was first created, and as I mentioned earlier, Druid did not really speak SQL. It was still very much JSON focused. And so there was a very specific driver created just for Druid and Superset to talk to each other. However, the rest of the space kind of really doubled down on SQL, and these database and the database drivers themselves were built on the same abstractions that the Superset project decided to go, which is, as I was showcasing earlier in that diagrammatic explanation, SQL Alchemy, again, for kind of doing this OOP style of database query formation, and then Python DB API 2.0. So in the Python community, this is the kind of a standard that is approached through a specific, I think it was PEP 747 in the Python community, which said that, if you're going to write a Python driver that connects to a database, here's what it should look like. Let's have everyone implement the same interface. And that's been great. And so the PyDruid connector is now kind of the most popular way to connect Druid to Superset. And in general, the community is moving away from any type of native connector because it's just too much to manage. There's over 100 different databases that people connect into Superset, and the community is basically aligned around abstraction and building on a mature platform, the SQL Alchemy platform, instead of trying to kind of maintain very, very specific connectors to each database. And it'll still work. SIP 11, SIP stands for Superset Improvement Proposal. I'm sure the Druid community has similar type of language, but SIP 11 was opened by I think it was John Bodley at Airbnb back in 2018, saying that, hey, at some point we should move away from the native connector, because if we want all the latest and greatest features, we're kind of moving in the SQL direction. So the deprecation process is going to start in the coming months. Anyone who's still on the old one is encouraged to move off of it, and then probably early next year there'll be a broader announcement. It'll still be enabled, and then kind of maybe 6 months later is when we'll say, all right, let's actually remove it and gut it from the code base. So it's still going to be around. You don't need to panic if you are using these, but just keep in mind that the path is to move away from the native connector and to move towards PyDruid, which is a great solution. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Superset now wants to be more than just a BI tool. It wants to be a platform. So it's just kind of very natural for open source as well, because you can already create custom Viz plugins, but why not actually make it much more easier instead of having to do this complicated creation of a JS bundle and then publishing this NPM package and then injecting that package into your build process. That's starting up Superset. It's super messy. And so the real eventual goal is, can we just have Superset aware of some JavaScript bundle? And you can even, it's not a stretch of imagination to think that you may even have an editor in Superset at some point to create custom visualizations, and then it's just available as just another chart type. So that's super exciting. Embedding is really exciting. I really call this embedding plus. Like, we've met with tons of organizations in the community that are building entire products actually on top of Superset, right? So Superset wasn't really designed with that use case in mind, but since the dawn of BI tools, everyone has been trying to do things like embedded dashboards, public dashboards, customer-facing analytics, productized analytics. Now I think the cool catchword is headless BI. So that is where, so Superset already has a lot of great foundation here, has a lot of the right components, and how do we actually make this much easier? So this is something the community and the core PMCs are thinking a lot about. And lastly, the API, right? Superset is very much a by engineer for engineer kind of project. The community is full of platform and data engineers, and so API programmatic access is super important. So the eventual design goal is to level up the API so that any end user action that you would do in the Superset UI is actually accessible via the API. And this enables things like more advanced version control workflows, where you can imagine people who need to kind of go through a lightweight Git process if they want to publish a dashboard, or if you're automatically creating Druid plus Superset dashboards, how can the entire lifecycle live as code, right? Dashboard as code, and then deployed to either your internal users, or in the case of embedding, this is where you can really actually build products on top of your data stack because it'll live in the same product development lifecycle. So all super exciting. And that's pretty much it. Happy to take any questions that people may have.
All right. Any questions for Sweeney? No questions so far in the chat window. Sweeney, as a somebody who's knowledgeable about the older BI tools like the Tableaus and MicroStrategies out there, one thing that might be nice is if you have kind of a newer demo of preset Superset and just an idea what, and then also like what does Superset add on top of Superset? That might be helpful.
Sorry, I think my browser crashed, which is always fun. Cool, I'm back. Sorry, what were you talking about?
So as somebody, and probably a number of people in this audience are used to, more traditional older BI tools like Tableau and
Yeah.
MicroStrategy, it might be nice to see kind of some of the newer stuff you have, and then also understand what Preset offers on top of Superset.
Sure thing. Yeah, happy to do that. So, window. Okay, here we go. Hopefully everyone can see this. I think you can. Yeah. So two-part question there, which is great. So I'll quickly talk about Preset Cloud. It's basically a multi-workspace cloud-hosted solution for Superset. So every instance here is a separate Superset instance, and like most commercial open source companies, we add things like compliance and role-based access control and stuff like that. And this is a little Office Space reference for anyone who's seen that movie. And so basically, once you've clicked into a workspace, it's very similar to the rest of Superset experience, but everything just kind of works out of the box. You don't have to deal with some of the headaches sometimes of open source. So yeah, this is kind of one of our prototypical dashboards that we often show off. This is our Slack dashboard. It's has a snapshot of data from our Superset community. So every one of these charts is kind of a separate chart object, and you can basically, as I was talking about earlier, you can have caching live at every level here. So if you want certain types of data to be updated frequently, you can do that. I also wanted to quickly showcase the filtering. So I was talking about the native filter. So there used to be an actual chart type, and instead, now you just click this pencil icon on the top left corner, and then you're kind of off to the races. So if you just wanted to look at, for example, a specific time zone, that's something that you can do. So you can do value, users, column, TZ, you can just call this time zone, for example. You can save it, and then you can choose, for example, you can see right here as I hover over this, the charts that are impacted by this filter. It's not all of them, right? Because some charts don't share the same column. But if I wanted to filter that table in the top right corner, just to people in Cairo and Casablanca, for example, I could do that, apply it, and that'll apply to all the relevant charts. So that's kind of like a little bit about the dashboard. It'll also be nice to show off Explore a little bit. So this is a cool little visualization. This is more for like fun visual candy. To be honest, I will say it can be a little bit difficult to actually understand, get insight out of it. So this is an example here where I didn't have to write the query. I just said channel 1, channel 2, right? So what I mean by that is this is basically a visualization of the people that live in any pairwise set of channels in our Slack community. And so I can just choose both of those channels here as one as a source, one as a target. I specify how I want the aggregation to happen. In this case, it's a sum. So it's just going to count the number of members in both. And here you can actually see, this is the query that Superset actually generated on your behalf. So it's pretty cool. And yeah, lastly, if you do want to get your hands dirty and go a little bit deeper, you have this full SQL editor right here, and you can kind of do the things you normally expect from a SQL tool. So it's kind of a little quick tour of the product. Yeah.
Very cool. One question from the audience: is it common to use Superset as a federation layer over multiple Druid clusters? Can you use Superset to present multiple Druid clusters as a single database?
Looks like my browser does not like the screen share. Yeah, curious what other questions people have.
Sorry, so is it common to use Superset as a federation layer over multiple Druid clusters?
Okay, is it common to use Superset as a federation layer over multiple Druid clusters? It's possible to present multiple Druid clusters as a single database in Superset. Really good question. I don't think there is. So Superset's data model is still relatively simplistic. So it kind of connects very directly into each kind of instance. So if you want to present multiple clusters as a single one, I don't think that's possible right now. I know people have done it using an intermediate layer. Like you can, first of all, there's two workarounds I would say. One is you could always do the kind of Trino Presto thing where you kind of join in this intermediate layer and it kind of pretends to be a table, right? The other option is in SQL Lab, you can actually, Superset does have a semantic layer, so you can do any type of joining that you want and then across multiple clusters, and then you can kind of coalesce that into a single table. And then as far as Superset is concerned, it's kind of a single table. So Superset does have attachment to that table metaphor still. There are ways around it, but yeah, you have to be a little bit creative.
Perfect. So next question, Druid is great in terms of performance and skill, but it's not fully ANSI SQL compatible. Does this impact some of the features that Superset wants to build or address?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's a really good question. So I would say most databases that Superset integrates with are not fully ANSI SQL compatible. There's always like, for example, a few months ago we did an event with MindsDB, and they're trying to do machine learning in their database, and they literally have entire SQL clauses that just straight up are not in ANSI SQL at all, right? So there's two things there. So right now in SQL Lab, as I mentioned, right, in the IDE, you can do whatever you want. If you want to do some new Japanese SQL dialect, or we've even done demos of tools where it's like some graph database, for example, right? And there's a completely different set of semantics. So in that case, in SQL Lab, that will still work. You can still use the IDE and write any query because that's going to go straight to your database, untouched by Superset for the most part. So that'll still work. The real question is in Explore or in the no-code interface. So I think the key there is pretty much all of the chart types and the no-code generation is not super complicated and chaotic, right? So if you were doing, like currently, there's no way to join, for example, right? So there's some databases, and I know Druid in the early days, like did not have kind of a strong opinion on joins. And so the good thing is that kind of the Explore no-code interface is very much designed to, it does expect you to have a somewhat clean data set. It expects some level of kind of dimensional data modeling. And so because of that, as long as you're kind of able to do like wheres, I think I spoke to one of our principal engineers. He said, as long as you have like a select star implemented for some features, things like getting table names, there has to be some concept of a database and a table and a schema. Those concepts in the broadest sense need to be implemented. And of course, you need the basic kind of 6 or 7 SQL clauses like select, where, from, group by, filter, that kind of thing. So it just needs the basics having. So it doesn't need all of it. So that's key. There's a really cool demo that Beta, one of our principal engineers, did, where he actually built a library to query like CSVs on the internet, right? So that's kind of it, basically in the middle, as long as you're as long as the SQL Alchemy little driver that you've built implements the 4 or 5 interfaces that we need, you would expect basically 98, 99% of the functionality works right out of the box. So hope that answers your question. Superset right now, because we aren't doing any kind of complicated joins or trying to support every type of potential clause that a database might implement, we're focusing on the common slicing and dicing use cases. I haven't yet come across a database that, that's going to be limited here.
Awesome. Any more questions for Srini? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, Srini, thanks so much for your time and your terrific presentation.
Absolutely. Thanks again. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day.
Oh, wait a second. Srini, you still there?
Yeah. Yes.
Do you see that? How many concurrent users can Superset support?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I think the way I would think about it, so I'll say that there's not a straightforward answer. It's very much depending on kind of how you're deploying it. So Airbnb and Dropbox run this, they have 5,000, 10,000 weekly active users. The real answer I would say is that Superset, it's a Python web application, right? So you kind of need to profile it and scale it depending on the limitations you're running into. So if you're getting timeouts on, most people run into issues more with their database
usually way before they run into issues with supersets. So if they're sending a bunch of select stars to the database and they're not kind of being careful there, that's usually where I've seen most people actually run into issues. But in terms of concurrent issues, like, Preset Cloud, we have, hundreds of organizations that use it. We have a multi-tenant setup, so you can always take Superset and kind of deploy in a more multi-tenant way if you want a little bit of separation and isolation there. But yeah, it's really just going to depend on the kind of usage that you have, and you'll just need to scale like any other web application. So adding some caching at every level where you're seeing bottlenecks, just getting better with handling the volume of requests, etc. But in general, like, Superset's pretty lightweight, right? So as I mentioned earlier, most of the speed comes from Druid or your database. Superset itself, you can really think of as just kind of a pass-through layer. So yeah, tons of people have scaled it. How the bottlenecks you specifically run into, you'll need to kind of handle using, web development best practices. So don't have a better kind of generic catch-all answer, but people are using it at scale. So yeah. So as a follow-up question, what's the most number of concurrent users you have seen? So I'd also say here, depends what you mean by concurrent. If you just mean like, daily active users or something, I've spoken to large tech companies that you definitely have heard of that are using it at the kind of 5,000, 10,000 a weekly active user and even like daily active user scale. But again, what do you mean by concurrent, right? Is it number of people that are looking at the same dashboard? There you'll kind of need to, again, because it's mostly kind of a front end for your database, if you're setting up your dashboards in such a way that it needs to hammer your database every single time when 20,000 people view that dashboard, then that's kind of a much harder problem to solve. If you have caching set up and some of the best practices that I mentioned, then you will have no problem. There are entire companies building products that are showing Superset dashboards to their users, and they have not run into issues there. But by far the issues that we hear about are on the data stack side. So hope that answers your question.
All right. Well, thanks, Srini. Really appreciate your session, and everybody enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.